In this video, we'll show how you can build a UX component that uses the Salesforce API to get data. So in this particular application, we have a list control over here, and the list control is going to be populated with a list of all of the accounts in my Salesforce application, or in my Salesforce account. And then once I've populated this list, then I'm going to basically be able to tap on a row in the list and get the details for the selected account. So you can see now when I click on this button now to go get the data from Salesforce, I get told here that I'm not logged into Salesforce. So the first thing I need to do is actually authenticate my account. So I'm going to go here and press the login button, and that's going to now start a Salesforce authentication flow. So I'll just go there and log in, and you can see now that after I authorize my Salesforce account, we return now back to the UX component, and the OAuth login completed event, which is a client-side event, has fired. So we have a little alert over there to indicate that the event is fired. And so now if I say get a list of Salesforce accounts, you can see now this time the Salesforce API is authorized, and here are all of the accounts that come back from our request. So now I can tap on an individual row in the list and get the details by making another request to the Salesforce API for that particular account. So every time I tap on a different row here, I'm making another request to Salesforce and getting the data for that account. So there's several different things going on here that we'll explain in detail. So the first thing was a button that logged us into Salesforce and allowed us to get the access token to make REST API calls. Then this button over here, which allowed us to make a call to Salesforce to get a list of accounts, and then we use that list of accounts to populate this list control. And then finally we have an event in the list control that makes another API request to Salesforce to get the data for the row in the list that we clicked on. So let's go back now to Alpha Anywhere and break down this UX component and see how it was constructed. So back now at in Alpha Anywhere, we can see now we have our UX component over here, and the component has a list control. It has a button to actually do the login, another button over here to make the request to Salesforce API to get the data to populate the list, and then a static text control that just simply has a div or a pre where we actually show the data for an individual account in the accounts list. So let's first take a look at the login button. So if we look at the login button here, we can see that we're using Action JavaScript to get an application level token. So if we go here and we edit this, we can see that this login button requires us to specify what Salesforce named resource we want to use, and in this case we only have one Salesforce named resource to use, and so there we've selected that over there. So when we press this button here, that's going to initiate the Salesforce authentication flow. Then the next thing we can do is go to the list control, and we can see that initially the list control has been set up with static data with two columns, account name and ID, and then in the list layout itself we're only going to display account name. And then finally we can see that in this button over here that goes and makes a request against the Salesforce API to populate the list. If we look at this button, we can see that this button is making an AJAX callback, and the function that it's calling is XB get Salesforce data. So we'll pause now and pick it up in the next video where we'll dive into this XBasic function that makes the request against the Salesforce API. So we're continuing now looking at how this UX component was constructed, and we're looking at how this button that makes a request to the Salesforce API to get a list of accounts and then populates this list control works. So we can see that this button here makes an AJAX callback to an XBasic function called XB get Salesforce data. So when we go and look at that function XB get Salesforce data, we can see that it's making a query using the Salesforce SOQL query syntax over here against the accounts table, and it's retrieving the account ID and the account name, and then it's using the Salesforce API request XBasic helper function to actually make the request, and it's using the named resource called Salesforce local in order to make that request. So let's just go take these 3 lines of code over here and go over to an XBasic function library file over here and just paste in those 3 lines of code and then do a show var JSON of the result that comes back from making the request. So if we go here and we run this, we can see that what we get back from the request is an object that has a property called records, which is an array, and inside this records array are properties called ID and name, and it's these properties here, ID and name, in this records array that we want to use in order to populate the list control. So if we go and look now at our XBasic code, so let's go back to, we can see that we're making the request against the Salesforce API, and then if there are no errors, we're taking the result, which is a JSON string, and we are passing it. So now we have an XBasic object, and then from this XBasic object we're going to retrieve the records property. So now PD is an array that contains all of the data that we want, and now we're going to basically loop through this array and extract the data for the ID column and the name column in order to create a new JavaScript object that has a property called ID and another property called account name, which are the 2 properties that the list control uses. And then we're going to basically take that JSON object and use that to populate the list control. So you can see here the response from this XBasic function is the JavaScript necessary to first of all get a pointer to the list and then to populate the list with the data that was retrieved from this XBasic function over here. So if we go and we actually step through this code, let's just put a debug 1 over here so we can see what this JSON object looks like after we've looped through all of the data. So let's go ahead now and run this and then step through the code. So here we go, we're running the component in working preview. We're going to go ahead now and click on this button. The XBasic function now gets called, and here we are inside the XBasic function that is handling the callback, and we've now looped through the PD array, which and then we can see now that we have a JSON object, and the JSON object basically has 1 row for each account, and each row basically has a property called ID and a property called account name, and then we're going to use this JSON to populate the list. So we go ahead there, click the run button, and you can see now that the list is populated, and now you can see when we tap on an individual row in the list we get the details for the particular account. So let's pause now and pick it up in the next video where we'll describe how the AJAX callback is made to the alpha server, which in turn makes the REST call to Salesforce to get the data for an individual account. So we're continuing now with our investigation of this UX component, and now we're going to look at how the code is implemented to actually go and get the data for the account that was clicked on in the list control. So we'll go back now into design mode, go back to controls, and then look at the list control and then show the list control property. So we can see that in the on-click event of the list, what we're going to do is get a pointer to the data in the current row in the list. So you can see here we're saying basically get the row number of the row that was clicked on. So the row number is going to be the 0 based row number that we clicked on. So if we click on the first row, this will be row number 0, etc. Then we're going to basically get all of the data in the list, which is this dot underbar data. And then we're going to get the data for the particular row that we clicked on. So then we're going to basically use square bracket R. So this gives us underbar D, which is the data for the row that we actually clicked on. But we want to know what the ID is that we clicked on. So we're then going to go and fetch the ID property from the current row. And then we're going to create a string here called data, which is a name value pair. So the name is underbar ID, and the value is the ID from the current row. And we're going to make an AJAX callback now to a different XBasic function here called XB get Salesforce data for an account. And we're going to pass back as the additional data this variable here, which contains underbar ID, underbar ID, and then the corresponding value of the account number. So let's go now and take a look at this XBasic function that handles the callback. So we'll go back now to XBasic functions, and we'll take a look at the get Salesforce data for account. So you can see here that we get the account that the user clicked on by looking at e.underbar ID. So the e object is passed into the callback, and this is the actual account that was selected. Then we're going to basically make a call to the Salesforce REST API endpoint to get the data for a particular account. So this is the endpoint, and the endpoint takes the account as part of the endpoint over there. We're then going to go make a request to the Salesforce API to this endpoint over there. Then we're going to get the result back. We're going to just reformat so that the JSON is nicely formatted, and then we're going to set the inner HTML of this element called div1 to the data for the current row. So let's go here and just put in a debug1 so that we can debug through the code when it runs. So we'll go back now into working preview. Then we'll go ahead and populate the list. So we still had our debug1 from the previous video left in. Then we'll click on one of the rows here, and we can see that now we're in the second callback. And if we look inside E, the E object that is passed into this callback, we'll see that e.underbar ID is the account number that the user clicked on in the list. So now we're going to construct our endpoint. So there's our endpoint over there now with the account number as the last item in the URL. Then we're going to go ahead now and make the request against the Salesforce API. So you can see what we get back is error is false. There was no error. And then there's the result. There's the JSON. But you can see that the JSON is not formatted nicely. It's just a string. So we're going to go ahead now and call the reformat function to make the JSON nicely formatted, as we can see over here. And then we're going to set the inner HTML of div1 to that result, so we actually go ahead and see the result over there. So there we can see the data for this particular account. So what we've shown in this video is how we can log into Salesforce, make an API request to get a list of the accounts to populate this list, and then when we click on an individual row in the list, how we can go and fetch the details for that particular account. Thanks very much for watching.